All right, so once we've made our connections and we're ready to move on, we're gonna work on the switch side. Okay. I forgot to mention this earlier, but you are going to need something thin to stick into our sacrificial mirror switch. Okay. So here is my sacrificial one. All right, let's pretend that one's sacrificial actually. Let's assume this is still connected to my door harness. Okay, and it goes right into the back of the switch. From your sacrificial harness, you're going to need to remove 3 wires. Okay, you're going to need to remove a black, a green, and a blue. If you don't have those 3 colors, don't sweat it. It's just easier to keep track when the colors match up with the wires of the motor, and black for ground. So you're going to need to depin this connector and remove those 3 wires. It's going to be really hard to show you guys, but inside this connector there's just a few tabs to lift so that you can remove the pins. But first you'll have to lift this little lock out of there. Alright, finally got it. Just enough pressure to pull this back and up. I don't know if you can see the slide here. Anyways, get that lock up and you should be able to see the metal right through there. There's a good picture of the pins. So if you see those white tabs towards the bottom, you're going to pull those away from the silver so that you can actually pull out the pin. And that's where a depinning tool like this comes in handy. But if you have something thin enough to fit in there, it doesn't necessarily have to be a dedicated tool like this. So once you have this top part unlocked and are able to get something thin enough in there to lift the white tab away from the silver, you should be able to just pull the wire right out. Hard to get a focus here. Just like that. Out it comes. So you'll need to do that 3 times total. 1 for the blue wire, 1 for the green wire, and 1 for the black. This red, don't worry about because it's actually already populated in your stock door harness. It is a brown wire. So just 3 times. Alright, so before we continue, I think it's important to understand how this motor works, how this motion is actually achieved. So here's where the 12 volt power supply comes in handy. So I can demonstrate. So we'll connect a negative alligator clip, see right here in the bottom right, negative alligator clip to the negative wire of my 12 volt power source, and then red alligator clip to my red wire on my power source. So these motors are reverse polarity motors. That means that as you change the direction of the electrical flow, the motor will move a certain way. So by default, I think the open position is when our green wire to the motor is positive. So we'll connect positive here. And our blue wire is negative. You can see it move out there. Now, when I reverse the flow of electricity, i.e. switch the polarities, red to black, black to red, it moves in the other direction, right? So, with that said, how do you reverse polarity of a wire? Well, thankfully for us, luckily, our OEM switch here takes care of that. As long as we connect the right wires to our brown and our black wire on our door harness. So, because it is a reverse polarity motor, I recommend fusing both our positive and our negative wires going to the motors, because it also reverses, right? So our negative then becomes a positive and our positive becomes a negative. So for safety, I would fuse both, not just one. All right, so how are we going to fuse both circuits or both wires? So we'll take two of the opposite ends of our connectors, right? So initially we wired it to this side. Now we want to grab the other side that it actually connects to. Come on, focus. Right, so we're going to grab, I guess this is female side, or male if you consider that the pins are in this one. Anyways, what we're going to do here is we're going to use one fuse for each circuit for both of the mirrors, or each wire for both of the mirrors. So that means we're not going to use 4 fuses, we're just going to use 2. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to connect our connectors to one another, right? Positive to positive, negative to negative, simple enough. Now, this is where your fuse holders are going to come in. You can use, like I said, the more common fuse holder, or if you're going to go the route I chose, the low profile fuse holder, we'll do that. So we'll add our fuse holder here, and now our positive is fused. Perfect. Then we'll grab the negative side here, and we'll add another fuse holder. Now we're fused on both sides. So you should have 2 fuses coming out of these connectors. So now our motors are going to plug in here. So on the other side of the fuse holders, all right, so let's assume this is connected here. So negative, right, we're going to start with that. Negative is going to be our blue wire from our sacrificial connector. So it should look like this. Blue wire going to the switch in your door harness, fused, and then the negatives for both of the connectors that go to the motors. And then for the green, we're going to do the same, but the green is going to be our red wire on the other side. All right, so like this. So green, fuse, and red. So after testing a little bit, I've determined that each motor will draw about 1 amp of current. So I'm going to put in a 3 amp fuse just to give it a little wiggle room, right? Because it's 1 amp per motor, so that would be 2 amps total. So I'll give it, I'll assume that during peak current draw, each one will draw about maybe 1.5 amps. So we'll say 1.5 times 2 motors, that's 3. So I'll put a 3 amp fuse in each of these fuse holders. Again, I used a glass one, but if you're using a standard fuse, then you know what to do with that. Alright, so because I'm sure I have viewers that haven't soldered before, I figured I'd do a quick little demo. I promise it's not as intimidating, or it's not as bad as it looks. I know it's intimidating, but once you do one wire, you'll feel really comfortable and want to do the rest the same way. So first things first, I like to get my helping hands ready. I have some insulation there, or some heat shrink, so that I don't puncture any wires. So let's grab the wire that I'm soldering. So I'm getting my blue wire, and I'm going to be soldering on this black wire. So what I'm going to do is interlock them. Make sure you can see there. And you see that? Probably not. There you go. So we're going to interlock them as best as we can. I think that's pretty good there. And then we're going to twist them onto one another. so that it looks focus like that. So now we'll put them in our helping hands to hold them. Just like that. Okay. Then get your soldering iron. I have a cordless one. This is a butane soldering iron. Definitely the best I've had in a while. It's made by Lexivon. And then you refill the butane right there, just like you would the torch if you have one. So we'll let that heat up for just a couple seconds. Get our rosin core solder. Make sure you do not get acid core. It will deteriorate your connection. Make sure it's a 60-40 rosin core solder. This solder is a bit thick. If you can find something thinner, I would recommend that. But first thing is to tin our soldering iron tip. If I can get this thing to focus. Hello. Okay, well, I'm just going to melt a little bit of solder onto the tip of our iron, and then we're going to hold it to our twisted connection there, and we're going to touch our solder to the wire, not to the soldering iron, but to the wire. The soldering iron is transferring heat to the wire so that our solder will melt when it comes into contact with the hot wire, which will allow the solder to bleed through the connection and secure it. Okay, let me show you what we're working with here. Okay, so there it is. Come on. There. It's not the prettiest, but it is a well soldered connection nonetheless. Okay. Usually before you do this, you slip on your heat shrink, but because this side of the wire is small enough for the heat shrink to go over it, I didn't put that on before. So now we'll grab our heat shrink. So most heat shrink tubing is going to be pretty long, so I like to cut mine to size just so that I have it over the connection and then over the wire, the insulation of the wire itself just a little bit. I like to make sure it's centered before we move on. Alright, and now we're going to grab a torch or just a lighter will do in most instances. Just like to pinch around and make sure it is centered. So we'll get our flame going here. And that's it. Now you have one of the most secure connections you can have. And it's the same profile as the wire itself, so it's not like a butt connector that pretty much doubles the size of that segment. So it's not bulky at all. It's secure. Alright, now let's do the green wire. This is going to go to our brown 12 volts in the OEM door harness for the switch. Again, I have purple and black. Those are just the only two colors I have in stock right now. But I'm going to make it work. As long as I can remember that blue is our negative, or our black wire. So again, you'll separate this a bit, and then fan this one out a bit, interlock them like that, just like that. And now we'll put our connected wire into our helping hands again. I don't know what I would do without this thing. It'd be very difficult to do any soldering work without it. Okay, so we'll get that all locked in. Wonderful. Got our soldering iron. Get it to heat up again. And do be careful with your soldering irons. It is very hot. Don't accidentally burn, your mirror or a component thereof. That would suck. So just be careful and realize that this is very hot. So we should be up to temp already. So let's see. Not quite. A couple more seconds. There we are. Alright, you can see the solder is now melting. So we'll put it on our wires. Hold. And touch our solder to the wire, not the iron. If you do that, your connection is going to be much weaker than if you do it like this, which is, there we go. Touching the wire, and the solder is melting. You want to get a decent amount in there to make sure that it is connecting well. Alright, now we can move our solder away. Make sure you have a well-ventilated area too. I have a fan going right now. I don't know if you guys can hear it, but you don't want to set off any smoke detectors. So, all right, again, we're gonna make sure our heat shrink is centered. Just pinch around, figure out where the insulation of the wire starts and where your solder joint is. We're gonna grab our torch, turn it on, or lighter, and shrink our heat shrink. If you get a heat shrink tube that's too big, you're going to have a gap in between the tubing and the insulation of the wire, so the purple part or the green part of the wire. And that just means you went one size too big on the heat shrink, so just try to cut it off. And well, really, if you've already made your connection, in most cases you're SOL, but in this case, like I said, this end of the wire is small enough for the heat shrink tubing to go over. But just make sure that it's as close to the size of the wire as possible while still being able to go over the solder joint. So there we go. Now both of my wires are soldered, and now I will solder on my fuse holder. Alright everybody, if you did follow those instructions, you should end up with something like what's underneath the measuring tape. That is sort of an intermediate harness. You'll see the blue and green ends that go into your OEM door harness on the left, and on the right you'll see the connectors that go to the motors. So I've measured the ideal length to be about 28 and a half inches. That's me measuring from where the OEM mirror connects to the switch in the door. So if you get it to that same length, you're not going to have any extra wire, and it's going to run along the existing door harness, and it's going to look really nice. And also notice how I did not put the fuse holders right next to each other, because that would bulk up that section of the harness too much. So I shifted one a little bit further downstream so that it would maintain as slim a profile as possible. And after you add the wire loom, you should end up with a nice pretty harness like we have here. And that will do it for this part. Like, comment, subscribe, and we'll be back for part 3 soon. I'm a legend, bitch, I'm swerving in that Acura. Smoking on that pretty Ricky on spectacular. Losing, that shit ain't in my vernacular.